Good day, everyone, and welcome to another Live with Kevin, another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We'll get to that in a second. So, whatever platform that you're on, I'm so glad that you're here. And if you would, say hello and tell us where you're from in the comments, because I'll be able to see them. We'll put some of them on the screen here in a few minutes. So, because you're with us live, you have the chance to be a part of this conversation. I'm going to introduce my guest in a few minutes, and I want you to imagine for that time that we are sitting around a table having a cup of coffee, glass of water, or whatever beverage is appropriate for you at the time of day it is in your part of the world. And so I just want you to, if we were all around the table having a conversation, you would share your comments, your questions, your ideas. And so I hope that you will do that here. It will make this more valuable for you. You may get a specific question you have answered, but it also will create a better conversation and eventually a better podcast, because the second use of this experience is to create an episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So having said that, now I'm going to do a countdown, which is where we will trim the audio and video for that podcast and do that introduction. And so I'm so glad that you're here with us live. And so with that, we're going to get started. So Marissa, this is for you in 3, 2, 1. Change affects all parts of our lives. And while we've dealt with it our entire lives, we aren't really very good at it, especially at work. Today, we're going to talk about the predictable players and steps in any organizational change effort. As we understand these steps, we can champion or captain, as my guest would say, change more effectively. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow both personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you're listening to this podcast, you could have been with us live. You couldn't be on this one live, but you could be in future ones live. And to know how to do that and get the schedule of those and be aware of those, you just need to sign up for one of our online groups, either on Facebook or LinkedIn. And you can join those by going to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. And that will get you connected, in the know, and being able to join us live in the future and really get this information sooner. Today's episode is brought to you by our latest book, The Long Distance Team, Designing a Team for Everyone's Success. You can learn more about that at longdistanceteambook.com, where you can learn more, get links to buy a copy, but also to get an excerpt of the book. Again, it's longdistanceteambook.com. I hope you will do that. And with that, I'm going to introduce my guest, bring him online, and then if I can get my act together, I will introduce him. And I will do that now. His name is Curtis Bateman. He is Franklin Covey's Vice President of International Direct Offices. He splits his time between the UK and Utah. With over 25 years experience in the training industry, he is an internationally recognized presenter, content developer, change consultant, business leader, and coach. His passion is for enabling organizations at change, and that has resulted in the co-creation of many of Franklin Covey's change solutions. Formerly the president and CEO at Red Tree Leadership, Curtis managed the Who Moved My Cheese brand. So he's been at this change business for a while and created a practical approach to helping individuals and leaders succeed in an ever complex world of change in the workplace. He is also now the co-author, one of 4 authors of the brand new book from Franklin Covey, titled How to Turn Uncertainty into Opportunity. That's our conversation for the day. And Curtis, thanks for being here. Glad to have you.
Nice to be here, Kevin. Thanks.
So how to turn uncertainty into opportunity. That's a lovely statement. It's a wonderful sentiment. We're going to get at what that means. But as I introduced you, we all got a little bit of a sense that a lot of your working life has been around change. So what sort of led you to that focus? I mean, sort of tell us a little bit about what led you to this kind of work, but specifically how you ended up focusing so much of your career and work on change.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because it's probably not a traditional path. I started in a technology industry selling subscription software to publishing houses. And when I went to do installations, I realized how much we were asking them to change as they implemented this, change their marketing departments, their finance department. And because I was part of the installation and implementation, it really landed on me how hard that was for these big publishing houses. So when there came a time to change in my career, I thought, wow, this is a space I've really enjoyed. Maybe there's something I could do with it. And as fate would have it, my career intersected with Dr. Spencer Johnson, the author of Who Moved My Cheese. And I got to learn from him for a number of years and partner with him. And from there, it just started to blossom and grow. So technology and helping organizations try and figure it out without all the right tools.
And now, full circle, from helping publishing companies to
Publishing,
writing
that's
and
right.
publishing a book, which is a pretty cool
Mhm.
piece. So one of the things, and Curtis, we didn't have the chance to talk about this in our sort of pre-conversation, but in our work, we do lots of work with organizational change and help leaders
Yeah,
become more effective in the change processes. So I was super excited to have the chance to read the book. And there are a number of really great pieces in the book. And I guess what I will do now is this, because there's not any shortage of books on change either,
that's right. Yep.
right? You just talked about probably the single most famous, or certainly one of the most famous
Hmm.
of them. What makes this book different?
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, it comes from years and years of practical experience working with leaders. And rather than it being, I went into a research mode. The research was done in the laboratory of real life with all these organizations and CEOs. So we not only tried to document what we observed, but document what worked as we tested and experimented for years. So that's one thing. The other thing is so many change leadership approaches focus on process or organizational structure. And and we decided a long time ago to flip that and say organizations hire talented people. Rather than bring in somebody to tell them how to change, let's increase people's change capability and then trust them in their own business to understand how to do process. Maybe they need some help, but they're pretty smart. They're going to figure a lot of that out. So rather than tell them what to do, and then when you're done, there's no additional change capability in the leaders, the people of the organization. We said, let's focus on people, help them get better. Let's help leaders get better. And over time, their competency increases and they'll figure out all the other details. And that was our entry point into it. And it's really guided our thinking, our writing, and all of the work we've done. And it's great. It does make us stand apart from a lot of the other approaches to change that you read about.
Yeah, so it really aligns with the way I think about things in two important ways. One is that it's individuals that are doing the changing, right?
Mhm.
And you got smart individuals that you've hired. And the other piece is that organizations don't even change. It's only people that change.
That's right.
And so I love that. I think that we're in alignment in that regard. So one of the things that you talk about early in the book, and I don't want to make this all about the book, although obviously that's one of the reasons we're
Right.
here. You talk about 5 common reactions that people have to change. You use a parable at the beginning where you actually name these
Mhm.
as people, but really it is reactions, because any and all of us have had all of these reactions
Yeah.
sometimes for the exact same change. So walk us through what these 5 common reactions are.
Yeah, I like the way you set that up because you said all of us may have had each of these reactions, which means the reaction isn't right or wrong. We're not labeling a person as that type of reaction. We're just saying in that moment, there was a reaction. So there's probably hundreds of reactions, but in the work that we've done, um, there are 5 really common ones that show up. And that's where we wanted to start to help people really grasp, oh, it's a reaction, and now I have a choice. So the first one is move. This is an individual that really is enthusiastic about something new. Maybe they were bored, maybe they don't like their work, or maybe they just thrive on new challenges. There's a strength to that. You got a lot of energy. The weakness might be that you go barging ahead unprepared or unskilled, and you cause problems. You create a lot of commotion. So a strength and a weakness, move. And then
Oh,
you've got,
and oh, by the way, they're the ones most easily influenced by the next new shiny
oh yeah,
object. Oh,
shiny object. My kids call it squirrel.
exactly. I was going to say that, but yeah. So
Yeah, so and there are strengths there that you can leverage. If we're talking about leading change, that's a strength, but you need to learn how to leverage it so that you minimize the weakness part of it. The second reaction is minimize, and this is a person that is managing their energy, managing their reaction, perhaps saying, "Gosh, I've seen a lot of changes come and go, so I'm going to do the least amount possible until I really see that I should engage." And that's okay, but it's a reaction based on experience and paradigm.
they're
Then
not
we've got
necessarily resistant or in the way. They're just,
cautious.
let's wait and see, right?
hmm And the great news is, as a leader, if you recognize that, you can do something to engage with them and help them start to pick up the pace. So you're right, that's not a bad thing. So then we have wait. Wait is saying, "Gosh, I've seen a lot of changes come and go, and they often just stop and go away." So
I'm going to wait this out. We're just going to
that's
sit
right.
back. This too shall pass.
Uh-huh. Because it's happened so many times in their career. And I like how you fold that. Yeah, prove it to me, right? They're just saying, "I can outweight you on this, and when it goes away, I'm all the smarter for not having spent any energy on this." Then you get into less desirable categories, but there could be purpose in it. So resist is actively pushing back against the change. This might be the person at the water cooler trying to undermine what they just heard in a meeting where the leader's talking about a new change. Now, maybe they know something that's been overlooked. Maybe they understand because of some expertise something that's been just forgotten about. So there could be validity in it. And that's why it's important not to label Kevin as "you're always a resist." No, in this circumstance, there may be a reason for it. Let's figure that out, and then let's move past it. And then
If we
as a
ignore their perspective,
there's
we may be
risk.
missing something. Because as
That's
a
right.
leader, we've been thinking about this longer than anybody else, which is one of the reasons we're past some of this. But the reality is that we have blind spots too, and we want to make sure that we're acknowledging that resistance, and see what we
Yeah.
can learn from it. Right?
I like that you said that, because leaders so often they start to work on it and they become increasingly narrow in their focus. I don't want to use the word myopic, that has a negative connotation, but it is, they become narrow in their focus as they say, "We're going to do this, we're going to do this," and they start to commit. And they have possibly created that risk of not gathering all the right data, the right inputs.
Yep.
And then there's quit and quits, just labeled under the category of quit. But one is, "I'm going to quit and leave. I don't like this change," which is so interesting, because if you quit and leave, you're initiating a significant personal change. But you're doing it because you feel like it's going to be better for you. You have more control of it. And then there's quits, which is what we call in common terminology quiet quitting. "I'm still here, but I'm not doing anything."
Yep. So how is that different from wait?
Weight is still quite a bit more influenceable than quits. Um, and this is one of the things that leaders can do: is they observe each of these reactions. They can identify, what would it take to influence this person to help them engage with the change. And you'll find with weight, it's less about being malicious and more about, "I've watched this movie before." And with quits, it's, "I don't agree with the change. I'm just not doing it." And so there may be some ill intent in that behavior, which is why it's worth calling it out a little separately. That doesn't make either one of them unsalvageable. It probably just means there's a different journey to take them on.
Yeah, that actually leads me to where I wanted to go next, Curtis, which is, and we're talking with Curtis Bateman, one of the 4 co-authors of the book Change: How to Turn Uncertainty into Opportunity. In working with leaders around the globe on changes of all sizes, which of these reactions do you, is there one of these reactions that you find leaders have the most challenge in responding to?
That's a really intriguing question. In my experience, leaders bring their own biases into leading change. And so it's more about the leader's experience leading change that creates the one that they struggle with, rather than all leaders struggle with this one. And
Okay, so let me ask it a different way, because I
okay,
think you're exactly right. It makes total sense because we're in this too, right?
mhm.
Uh, so let's do it this way. If as a leader, I'm more frequently in move, which of the five is hardest for me?
Yeah, I'm glad you picked move. If you're in move, once you get past move and minimize, then wait, resist, and quit are all real challenges for move because it feels like dead weight. What's the problem? Why won't you engage? And so that one's of particular interest. And there are a lot of leaders that are really driving hard. And so they will find themselves confronted with that move versus the other reactions challenge.
And by the way, whether they're driving that either because that's their natural tendency or they think that's what they're supposed to do,
That's right. That's right.
or they're being incented to do or whatever, right? So there could be lots of reasons underneath that. So the core of the book really gets at your four zones
Mhm.
of, we'll call it the change process, if you will. So why don't you talk about each of the four zones, and I'll just uh, interject, ask a question or two
Yeah.
along the way as we talk about each of the four. And as you all are listening, I want you to be thinking about a change that you're personally in or that you're leading through now, because this will be way more valuable for you if you're if
Mhm.
you're if you're tying it and hooking it to something real in the moment. So Curtis, as you go through them, I'm going to be encouraging everyone who's listening to say, oh yeah, that's where we are right now, because we may
That's good.
recognize all of them, and I think people will. But if we can get all of you to be thinking about one, thinking about a change, and this is where we are, this will be far more useful to you. So with that
Yeah,
preamble, the first one is the status quo, right? So talk about
that's
that,
right.
because that's, we're not thinking about the change
That's
yet.
right. So what's interesting about the status quo, so obviously change happens over time. That's our horizontal axis in this framework. And our vertical axis is what kind of results are we getting? And as we head into a change, we often find ourselves in a place called the status quo, which, if we're fatigued from a previous change, feels like a resting place. Whew, I get a little bit of a break from this. And there's risk in that because it means we're not conditioning our change muscles to be ready for the next change. So we want the reprieve, the relief from the change. And if we're not careful, we can actually put ourselves at risk for the next change. So zone of status quo, getting the results we expect, it's predictable, and we're not actively in the middle of a change. And then a change gets introduced, either externally or internally within our organization. And the minute the change gets introduced, we start to decline over time in the results that we're getting. That might be a financial result. Maybe it's employee engagement. Maybe it's our own personal engagement as a leader. Maybe it's opportunity cost. But whatever the case, when a change is introduced, there's always this decline or impact on results in the second zone called the zone of disruption. And the zone of disruption is really where individuals and leaders are looking to gain clarity. They want to know what's changing. What is it that's really changing and why is it changing? Do I agree with the why? And then the ever important one that we all care about, what does it mean to me? What does it mean to me? Me personally, as a leader, as an individual. If I'm a leader and it has two different meanings for me.
Yep.
And so, and until we gain some clarity, Kevin, in that zone and we can answer some of those questions, we actually get stuck in a period of decline in the model until we can answer those questions and move through this doorway, which is called the point of decision, where we make the choice to start working on the change. So those reactions we talked about generally emerge in the zone of disruption. And then we're trying to figure out how to move beyond that into how do we work on the change and get it implemented, which we call the zone of adoption. We call it that because that's where all the heavy lifting, the hard work of implementing change happens. And it's also where most changes start to fail to reach the outcome we wanted because we hit dead ends, we hit things that don't work like we thought. And so we have to persist and really find a way to commit to why, and then work on the how and the what. And so it feels like there's steps forward, steps backwards, as we try and rebuild and reclaim the results ground with the
That
change.
we've lost, right?
Yeah, that we've lost. And so what you see then is a U-shaped dip in disruption and adoption. And that dip represents a tangible cost related to the change. And we're trying as leaders to minimize that cost, shrink how long and shrink how profound the depth is. And then we get to this point where a lot of companies and people will stop. They'll just say,
Yeah, can
oh,
we stop there before we go on to the
that's
fourth
right.
zone? Because is it fair to say, as we've talked about the first three, the status quo, the zone of disruption, the zone of adoption, that is it fair to say that most people would say the zone of adoption is the change effort?
They would. And it's
And
true. There's a lot of effort there.
and and so if we don't, what's the downside of us not recognizing or thinking about the first two zones and sort of saying this change is all about the zone of adoption? What's the risk?
Yeah, a lot of leaders have a propensity to do just what you're describing. They skip to the third zone. So you've seen this movie before, I can tell. um, so what's the risk? The risk is our people don't come with us. And when our people don't come with us, we end up just driving at it and saying, do more, but we haven't captured their hearts and minds. They don't have a reason to engage. So they're not helping us. We're pulling them along rather than having them lead the way because we're enabling them to engage with the change. So we miss leveraging all their capability. We miss leveraging their hearts and their backs. We miss their creativity, and we create more work for ourselves as leaders. So, and it's a very common mistake to skip right to that point in the change process.
And I think there's another piece to that. Everything you said, yes, 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 yes. And I think the other piece of that is, and because what you're describing is on a timeline, and you said it earlier, that as leaders, we're involved in this change earlier, have more, whether we're the one implementing it or not, whether it was all right, initiating it or not, like we've had more time to think about it. We've had more time, like we have already gotten through, in a way, the two zones for ourselves.
That's
and
right.
now we think because we're there and it's completely clear to us, it should now be clear to everyone else. You use a metaphor in the book, what I'm going to call the movie metaphor, about if someone comes into the movie late. So talk about that, because I think this is what happens. Like, and this is why one of the big ways that we as leaders mess this up. We're ahead of everyone else mentally, intellectually, and emotionally, and we can't see why they're not with us.
And we forget that it may have taken us 2 months, 6 months to get to that point. And somehow we want them to hit fast forward and go through that emotional journey, which it's not a reasonable request to make. It's poor leadership, right? It's just not a reasonable request, but we do it all the time because we haven't stopped to consider what you and I are talking about right now. So in the story, in the book, we talk about, if you show up late to a movie and you don't learn who the protagonist is, what's actually created the friction point for the whole story of the movie, you spend the whole movie trying to catch up and figure out why are we in this circumstance? And it makes it hard because you're a confused passenger in the journey rather than being able to savor, enjoy, learn from, grow from, or in a change context, participate in. And so
Well, let's just go back on what you just said. How, uh, you know, uh, virtually by show of hands, for those of you that are here live, actually, you can raise your hands. Like, how many of you ever have been a confused journeyer on a change? And like every hand is being raised, right?
Yep.
And it's
Yep.
related to this propensity for us to go too quickly, assuming everyone else can go far quickly in this journey than we have.
Yeah. Which is why, I've done some research on this with participants over about a decade. 88% of people expect the change to lead to something worse for themselves. And that's not because it always does, but in their experience, because they walk in after the opening part of the movie, it's always such a rough ride for them that it makes it even hard to recognize the value, if there is value created at the end of the change process.
And to your point, 88%, but even, whether it's 88 or 68, doesn't matter.
60, who cares?
The reality is as human beings, we're wired to have a negativity bias. So even
Mhm.
if we could get people to go back in their history and say which ones were positive and which ones were negative, even if more of them were positive than negative for themselves, that's not what they remember. So when
That's
we're
right.
in it, that's still the mindset we've got.
Mhm. And that's the mindset that leaders can recognize and influence. And imagine if you could just help with this one idea we're talking about. Bring your people on the journey of how we got to do the why and the what we're doing. Imagine what that would change from their mindset as you ask them to engage in the change. How much better would the change go?
I would go as far as to say, everybody, that the why is more important than the change itself, because
Mhm.
ultimately that's what will move people,
That's right.
right? So we've talked about three of the zones. We've talked about the zone of the status quo, the zone of the disruption, the zone of adoption, and then I stopped you because I
You
wanted
did.
to have this conversation. But there's one
Good.
left, and
That's right.
not everyone gets there. But if we do, we can celebrate. But what's the last zone?
Yeah. So it's the zone of innovation, like you've got on the screen. So let me talk about why people don't get there, and then let me talk about why we want to get there. So often there's been all of this effort in the dip, right? In this U shaped dip, that people feel like, oh, we got back to a level of performance where we were, and they want to celebrate it. It's maybe been hard or really challenging or created some cost. And so they want to celebrate. But when you do that, it's like pulling off the freeway one exit too early while you're driving somewhere. And then you're like, well, we didn't quite get there. And so the zone of innovation is looking at saying, in adoption, what did we learn that we didn't even know before we started the change? And now that we know that, could we do anything to amplify those learnings? And the more we can amplify what we've discovered about how to implement this change, we find that that curiosity generally leads to extending the value of the change. And so the curve continues to go up and to the right. And the area under that curve, above our old status quo, but under the innovation curve, is where all of the return on your change investment starts to appear. And that's
That's
why we
why
don't
we
want to
did it to
stop.
start with.
That's right. That was the whole purpose. And if we don't allow ourselves to get into that space and explore it, we've just charged ourselves the cost of change without giving ourselves any of the return that should come from the change. So it's curiosity. What have we learned? What else could we do? What could that lead to? How do we amplify that? And then we let that play out over time and it creates all this benefit for us from the change.
So, Curtis, we've been talking about this from an organizational perspective, and I didn't want to finish, and I know you don't want to finish without at least a little conversation about the fact that as leaders, we're wearing two hats. We're wearing the hat of leading this change, being a captain of this change, but also living through this change. So, what in very short order, what are a couple of insights to share with us now as individuals in any part of our life, not just at
Yep.
work,
Yep.
in terms of this change model and your work?
Yeah.
What's your advice?
So you've made the start of the first point. As a leader, I'm experiencing the change as an individual while trying to lead it. So the model applies to you in two ways. And it's good to acknowledge that Don't try and just ignore the fact that you're a human being in the change process. The second idea I'd like everybody to take away is this model works in personal and professional circumstances equally well. So if you just find it, look at it, and draw it, you can talk to a teenager about it. You can talk to a friend over dinner, just that shape on the book there. And what you'll find is it creates tremendous value, even in personal circumstances. And that's what we want. We want it to help people, teams, leaders, and organizations. And the model that works in all four of those scenarios.
Curtis, I am confident that you and I could have a long conversation, whether the cameras were on or not. That would be enjoyable. And we only have so much time. So before we go into the final stretch of questions I have for you, is there anything I didn't ask or that we didn't talk about that you wish we would have?
Yeah. So the other thing to keep in mind is, as a leader, you're not trying to go to the magic bullet here. We're simply trying to say, what if we could do it 20% better? What if I could apply a little bit of skill because I've learned this framework and I can do it 20% better? And the more I use that skill, that change muscle becomes stronger. And we can go from change being this thing that we dread to moving to change skill, all the way to change competency, where our ability to see the change through the model and the framework and through our people gives us the ability to become experts at leading change and creating tremendous value personally and professionally for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's so very important. Once we understand the framework, and we can start to see changes around us through that lens, we have a much better chance of being successful. So a couple of other things, Curtis, before we finish. One is when you're not working with clients, working with other Franklin Covey units, what do you do for fun?
Oh, so I loved. I'm at an offsite meeting today, and over lunch I went outside and started taking photos. I love to take pictures, and there
You
were some
just use
beautiful
your
flowers.
phone, or do you use an actual camera?
I have both. I have professional grade camera equipment and a very modern phone for the best cameras. I love to take pictures. I went out with my daughter over the long weekend looking for barns to take pictures. So I love to do that. And we live in the mountains in Utah, and I love to go hiking. We live right adjacent to that. So I love time in the mountains. I usually do 3 to 5 miles just in the mountains to be outside to recharge. In addition to spending time with my family, but they usually do those things with me. So it's a double benefit.
It's a double win. So the only thing you knew I would ask you is this question. So what are you reading these days, Curtis?
Well, I told you I usually have 3 books on the go, so I'll just pick one. I'm reading a book called The Founder's Mentality, which is really fascinating because it looks at the transition from being a business founder into a business that's maturing. And there's some really great insights that I'm gleaning. Chapters 4 and 5 for me have been spectacular. Just looking at how do you not get trapped in forgetting about what drives your business. So, but I also like to read classics and lots of other books. I'm reading one right now about the origins of a mom changing the laws around cerebral palsy and getting different treatment for kids in the US. So I like lots of things.
The Founder's Mentality is one thing that you will find in the show notes. You will also find a link to this book, the brand new book that we've been talking about, Change, How to Turn Uncertainty into Opportunity, of which Curtis is one of the 4 authors. And he's the first one on the list. It's not alphabetical, so maybe you were the most important, Curtis. I don't know. But you don't have to answer that question, and I am just teasing. But in terms of the book and your work, where do you want to point people? What do you want to tell people? Where can they learn more? Anything there before we start to wrap up?
So the book's available in all the bookstore places you'd expect. You can get the Kindle, the audio book, the hard copy that you've held up there a couple times in all of your traditional book purchasing sites, which we'd really appreciate. But the book's tied to some work that Franklin Covey does. We take this idea and this framework and we work with organizations and leaders. And so if you go to franklincovey.com, you can find out more about where we do keynotes on this, where we'll do programs where we'll work with leaders to help them create transformation and change in their organization. So that's at franklincovey.com. You'll see a speakers page there from me. And of course, if you want to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn, Curtis Bateman, and I'd love to connect with you there as well.
All right. So before we go, I have a question for all of you. I'll let Curtis take a break. Here's the question. Now what? What action are you going to take? I prepped you for this earlier by saying, as you're listening, think about a change that you're living through right now. And so hopefully there's something from that lens, from those current moments that you can take from what we've just been talking about. So the question becomes, what are you going to do with what you got here? Because if you don't, the value that you will have gotten here is far less than it would be otherwise. So I challenge you with that question. I urge you to ask that question. And Curtis, I thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Kevin.
So before we go, everybody, you know the drill. You're listening to this somewhere, which means wherever that is, wherever you get your podcasts, there's a chance for you to like this, to refer others to it, to star it, review it. You know the deal. Make sure you're subscribed. Do those things. We'd love to have you back because we're here every week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.